Fermat's last theorem says that if you have an equation of the form x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n, that has no solutions for integers above 2. So it's solvable for the exponent 2, but it's not for 3 or any other higher number. And Fermat wrote a little note saying that he had a proof of the theorem, but there wasn't space to write it in. Pretty clear that he didn't have a proof of it. Wiles has contributed to knowledge. He showed that Fermat's last theorem is true. He didn't do that by providing a narrative. I'm not providing you a narrative when I calculate the split for the dinner bill. There are narratives you can tell about those things. A very interesting narrative about Wiles' proof, a very uninteresting narrative about my splitting the dinner bill. But that doesn't make either of those two things narratives. So to say a little bit about proof and certainty. So I can calculate the dinner bill wrongly, and Wiles might have done the same. In fact, he did do the same. When he first presented his proof in '93, it was wrong. There was a gap in, there's a mathematical induction stage, and he had got it wrong. It took him 2 years to correct the error. Actually, he discovered that he didn't need to make a correction. He could just draw on another theorem that had been already proved. So you could say, well, then what he had, first of all, wasn't a proof, because it didn't prove what he'd set out to. I personally don't want to think about proofs in that way. I follow Imre Lakatosh's little book, Proofs and Refutations, which I think is an unrecognized philosophical masterpiece that few people read, I think, who says that proofs don't prove, they improve. And I think there's a lot in that. So, but even if you use proof in a very, very strict way, so that nothing's a proof until it's actually logically valid, then I think the point still holds that what Wiles was doing was not presenting a narrative, but something that, if it didn't match the standards of proof, was aiming to match them. And that's not what a narrative is intended to do. So when it comes to narrative, to proof, we accept, or mathematicians accept, the following principle, that it should be possible to decide whether the proof can be shown to be sound, that is, the premises are true, and the conclusion follows from the premises. Wiles was trying to meet that condition, didn't succeed at first. He did then. I think it's not impossible that somebody will find that, Wiles' paper is 100 pages long. Are we absolutely certain that there isn't another mistake in there somewhere? I don't think that we are, but I think there's not much reason to believe that. Anyway, that kind of condition is not a condition that we expect a narrative to satisfy. So assume for the moment that we're dealing with a non-fictional narrative, which may not be entirely true, but it aims at truth. So what would be defective about a narrative of that kind? Well, what are we trying to do when we produce say a historical narrative? I think we could regiment, nobody puts it like this, but we could regiment the project in something like this way, to say, well, look, a number of things which I'm going to specify here in the narrative have happened. If those things did happen, then something else, E, let's call it, would probably have happened. And as a matter of fact, E did happen. And then we've got a kind of narrative explanation for the occurrence of an event, E, I've called it. We're not saying that given what happened, E must have happened. Nobody ever says that about narrative explanation, or at least they shouldn't. But rather that in the circumstances, it was likely that it would happen. It was probable. There's a lot of difficulty packed into the idea of probability there, but I won't go into that. So there's an epistemic difference. However we go for definition here, there's an epistemic difference between narrative and proof. With proof, we aim at a definite fixed point, soundness of argument. That's what we're aiming for. Don't always get there, but that's what we're aiming for. If we haven't got it, then the proof is deficient, which isn't to say it's worthless, but it's not where we want to get. With narrative, there isn't any such fixed point. Narratives are endlessly challengeable. It's always possible that somebody's going to come up with some further proposition that we hadn't thought about, and which, if it were true, that would defeat the explanation of the narrative that we're providing, and maybe there's some reason to think that it is true. Now, of course, in practice, we don't go on endlessly challenging the narratives. There often becomes a point where further challenge isn't helpful. The possible circumstances that would undercut the explanation are very unlikely, say, or the narrative just isn't consequential enough for it to be worth that further investigation. So we come to a stop, but that doesn't mean that we've reached the sort of point that we reach to when we've got a sound argument in proof. Now, I've linked narrative to the idea of explanation, but do narratives always aim at explanation? That's not always the primary or most obvious goal of narrative. I agree with that. But I do think that without it, it's somewhere in the picture, we don't really have a narrative. Instead, we have what people sometimes call a chronicle, simply a list of things that happened. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Even if your narrative just consists of telling me what happened in some conversation, I think there has to be an implication that somehow what was said first bears some explanatory relation to what was said afterwards. And if it doesn't, then you've got to tell me a story about, well, the person who spoke next misunderstood what the person who spoke first had been talking about. Even if that isn't right, even if narrative isn't tied so closely to explanation as I've suggested, and I think I'm entitled to focus on the idea of explanation here, given that my topic is narrative and knowledge. So finally, on general points about narrative, the narrative isn't an absolute notion. So there are things which are very narrative and things which are marginally narrative, and then there are various things in between. So when it comes to the Bible, which I will talk about a little bit, Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, I think, are pretty narrative sorts of things. Leviticus doesn't strike me as being a narrative. It's just a series of injunctions about what you are supposed to do, if I've got that right, and don't imagine for a moment that I'm an expert on this. Deuteronomy, that seems like a sort of a mixture to me. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there which is really just listing in things that you're supposed to do, but there's the death of Moses in there, and that is given in narrative form. So that is a kind of intermediate case. So bearing that in mind, so getting knowledge from narrative, just go back to that proof of Fermat's last theorem. Certainly by reading a narrative, and I have read a narrative, quite a good one, Simon Singh's book on Fermat's last theorem, you can learn quite a lot about Fermat's last theorem. And I can learn that Fermat's last theorem is true. I take his word for it. Like most of the things I know because I take people's word for it. I could also know all sorts of other stuff that Wiles didn't actually prove directly Fermat's last theorem. What Wiles did was to prove another proposition, the Takayama-Shimura-Weil theorem, conjecture, because it wasn't a theorem, people didn't have a proof of it, which itself entails Fermat's last theorem. So by proving that intermediate stage, it follows that Fermat's last theorem follows, but he didn't actually prove it directly. So you can learn all sorts of stuff from reading a narrative, and that is what I have done in that case. What I'm less likely to get, maybe, is understanding. So you might say, well, look, you know various things about Fermat's last theorem and the proof of it. Do you understand the proof? Certainly not. Absolutely not. So again, understanding comes in degrees, I think. Perhaps nobody, including Wiles possibly, understands that proof completely. Certainly very few people do. Maybe on the basis of my reading and my very, very impoverished mathematical knowledge, I understand it a tiny bit. But you couldn't really claim substantial understanding unless you engage appropriately with the proof itself. Now, what is then the test of that sort of understanding? It's not surely that you have a feeling or conviction that you understand it, because you can have that feeling and not understand something. It's not being able to repeat the proof. That would be quite an achievement, I agree. It's 100 pages long. But one might possibly be able to simply memorize it and reproduce it by rote. So I think here we need to think not in vertical terms, that is, premises giving us a conclusion, but rather in horizontal terms. And let me explain what I mean by that. And I mean something like, and this does take us back to the previous talk, I think, in ways that I found interesting while we were listening. I mean something like being able to think sensibly about related possibilities. So Wiles' attempt to prove it failed at first, and then people wondered, well, okay, if the proof doesn't work, what does it show? Because it was a huge advance in mathematical knowledge, even if he couldn't actually get right to the point of proving it. It was generally agreed that the proof would still be very valuable in terms of what it told us mathematically. Somebody who really understands the proof ought to be able to say something about that. Wiles' proof opens up huge areas of new methods in mathematics, and somebody who understands the proof needs to understand about the sorts of things that you would now turn your attention to if you wanted to use those methods to prove new things. What sort of things are most likely to be susceptible to proof using those methods? So I'm going to call that explanatory breadth. So instead of thinking vertically about knowledge, gaining knowledge from premises to conclusions, either argumentatively or via narrative, I want to think in a horizontal way about explanatory breadth. So we think of narrative in vertical terms. This happened and that happened, so the other thing happened. But thinking about narrative horizontally asked us to consider variations to our premises. So what would have happened if slightly different things had happened? Now, it's very difficult to answer those sorts of questions, and generally one is not in a position to be confident that one's got the right answer, but there are intelligent answers that one can give and less intelligent answers that one can give. Answers that have some plausibility to them, some probability, and answers that are sort of off the horizon. So I think that's an important aspect of explanatory understanding. I'll just move on from there, when it comes to narrative. Now, does that really take us beyond knowledge to this new domain of understanding? After all, I might learn from a narrative something about the sorts of questions that I've just posed. I don't think they're raised in Singh's book, but they might be, and I could learn about them. But what's important for establishing one's understanding is that one has the ability to come up with these things oneself. So the test of understanding the proof or the narrative is that one goes beyond it to develop one's own knowledge, and that is the test of understanding it itself. As Alison Hills has argued in a number of interesting papers on this, understanding is a skill or a capacity. So we're not talking about adding propositional knowledge, we're talking about adding the capacity to acquire certain kinds of propositional knowledge. So the test of narrative understanding I want to suggest is not the ability to repeat the narrative, even with some variation in the words. That won't be enough. We're looking for explanatory breadth here, the ability to draw conclusions about scenarios that vary the circumstances of the narrative. You understand or claim to understand how the Korean War took place, then you ought to be able to answer certain questions like, well, if things had gone in a slightly different way at a certain point, what would most probably have happened at that point? Okay. So far I've been talking about non-fictional narratives. The implication has been historical narratives. And we think of those historical narratives as conveying knowledge because they constitute testimony of some kind. They're vehicles by which people tell us things. If we bring fictional narratives into the discussion, we don't leave the domain of knowledge, it seems to me. So somebody might write a novel about Wilde. I won't be surprised if somebody does this, actually, because it is a very interesting story. Somebody writes a novel about Wilde's proof of Fermat's last theorem. Now, if they do that, I think we're going to, most of us, expect that the math, insofar as it's in the book, and it isn't all going to be there, will actually be correct. And it would be grounds for comment and probably criticism, I think, if it was discovered that the description of the math wasn't true to what the math was actually like. With this novel, as with other novels, we expect, at least in certain kinds of cases, that they will be built around a framework of reliable facts. So fictions generally, I think, but in particular historical fictions, have some degree of reliability about them, and we can often have reasons for thinking that a good deal of what is said in the fiction is actually correct. So I don't think that there is a sort of big divide here between historical fictions and historical narratives and fictional narratives. When we move over to the fictional case, we don't leave the possibility of knowledge behind us. So very briefly, let me finish by saying something about fiction and the Bible. And I think that some of this might be helpful for discussing the Bible as a source of knowledge. So one might take the view that the Bible as a source of knowledge stands or falls on its credentials as an historical record. My sense is that the scholarly community doesn't on the whole think that it is terribly reliable, and many people seem to think it's highly unreliable. How can anything I've said here help with that? Well, suppose we take the extreme view that the Bible is fiction. So Robert Alter, someone I've read and admired, says prose fiction is the best general rubric for describing biblical narrative. And I guess he knows about these things a lot more than I do. I don't think that means, and I don't think he thinks that means that the books of the Bible are wholly false. What it means very roughly, and I think this is very rough, is that they were not presented at the time as assertions of fact, but rather as imaginative stories. If that's true, and I'm not saying it is true, but if it is true, that wouldn't imply that they serve no epistemic purpose. And we have plenty of examples within the Bible, I think, for avowedly or at least clearly fictional stories which do have epistemic relevance. So the parables of Jesus, Jesus is surely not reporting events that he knew about which had occurred. These are stories invented by Jesus or from some other source perhaps, which are intended to answer difficult questions about moral matters or about our relation to God and God's will and purposes. And there's no reason in principle why the books of, say, the Old Testament could not be understood as things which orient us in a preferred direction, helping us better to see God and the world. Whether they do that effectively, of course, is a further question, but the point I'm making is simply that calling the Bible fiction doesn't signal that one is disconnecting the Bible from the idea of knowledge. Alter, in talking about this, have I got a couple of minutes to go? Okay, right. Makes what I think is an interesting point about why he thinks it is that the biblical stories are fiction. And he takes the example of the story of David and Saul. This is just an example, and I think he would say the same about a lot of other stories in the Bible. And his argument, I think, is this, that the best hypothesis we can have about the intentions of the author of the story of David and Saul is that these are imaginative constructions. Why? Well, because the characterizations given, the events described, seem designed to fit an interesting and instructive narrative rather than to help us understand something that has actually happened. And he contrasts that, I find this interesting, with, say, the writings of Thucydides, the ancient historian, who did certainly invent dialogue. I mean, it's quite clear that Thucydides is not reporting things that he had actually heard. But Alter thinks there's a difference between these cases, because he thinks that Thucydides is engaged in a genuinely historical project, because what he's doing is a stylized technique of representing the various positions maintained by different historical personages. So he thinks of that as part of the legitimate historical enterprise And that's different from what's going on in the story of David and Saul, or in, say, Shakespeare's histories, or for that matter, Aeschylus's The Persians, where there's clearly a fictive intention primary there, and Thucydides is different from that. So that I think is an interesting point to make, and it bears on a debate that Stacey and I have had endlessly over the decades and decades that we've been talking about. May come up later on. Okay. Finally, let me just say something about religion and the breadth requirement. So I said that understanding I wouldn't say this is maybe essential to all understanding, but it's an enhancement of understanding. If we achieve this kind of breadth of explanation, we can think about alternative possibilities. But it does strike me, and people may feel that this is historically wrong, that there's a tension between the devotional attitude to religious texts displayed within religions and the requirements for understanding them, if you think of that in terms of a breadth requirement. Why is that? Well, religions imbue their constitutive narratives with a kind of necessity. This is not merely how things were, but this is how they had to be, in some sense, given God's purposes. To that extent, and what extent exactly that is a matter of debate, I think, religions will discourage attention to explanatory breadth, I think. They would discourage attention to the thought, what would have happened if the Annunciation hadn't taken place, or if Pilate had made different decisions at the trial of Jesus or something like that. It seems to me that those sorts of questions are discouraged by a devotional attention to texts which emphasizes their necessity. Maybe not their logical necessity, but their necessity in some strong sense. Clearly, within religions, there's a lot of variation on approach to this. So in fundamentalist approaches, there's an enormous amount of rote learning of text, which does seem to me very discouraging to this kind of breadth requirement. And I'm not suggesting that religions or all forms of religious practice do this in the same way, but it does seem to me that there is a kind of tension here in the religious outlook on the necessity of the narrative that you're talking about, and the requirement for a breadth condition for properly understanding the narrative. Okay, thanks.